Good afternoon, everyone. The conversation this year for businesses isn't whether to migrate to the cloud. It has been how do you get the cloud applications, the cloud benefits, given how quickly the technology is moving and how constrained it is in terms of spending money and being efficient with how you use these resources. And what this panel attempts to do is to look at all the different ways the different companies are adapting to the cloud in sort of creative ways in order to keep certain data on site, in order to keep legacy systems, and in order to preserve certain applications while transforming others. And the panel that we have for you today is phenomenal. We have George Elissaios. He's Director of Product Management for Hybrid and Edge at AWS, the largest, I believe, cloud services provider in the country. Laura Money, Executive Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Sun Life Financial, where she has met a lot of her colleagues virtually after starting there in the pandemic, a new era where cloud has been ever more important. And of course, our own Anurag, Rana, Sector Head and Senior Analyst, Bloomberg Intelligence. And I wanted just to start with talking about how different companies are using a different cloud models, so we can kind of move away from the conversation of just migrating to the cloud and figure out the different kinds of examples of how companies are being creative. And I'd love to start with you, George, the sense that you have just sort of a broad brush of different ways that people are keeping their data on site while also tapping the cloud.
Yeah, thanks, and great to be here. Well, what we've seen really over the last few years is a tectonic shift of customers moving to the cloud, as you mentioned, and we've seen here before. We have seen millions of customers from practically every vertical that is possibly imagined, right? That moving into the cloud. And from an AWS perspective, what that means more traditionally is the AWS region. These are the core infrastructure offerings of AWS, which you traditionally would think of as the cloud offering, like the big cloud, right? This is where most of the use cases and workloads really run on, because they offer you the most scalable and the most cost-efficient and elastic way to run your applications. However, while we've been increasing the number of regions across the year, starting from one region, reaching 26 regions, and with another 8 announced across different countries in the world, what we've seen is we've seen a rise of different applications that have a harder time moving into the cloud, and this could come because of different reasons. One of the common reasons is there is a dependency to some legacy system. Think of, I have a database that I've built over the years, or decades even, which cannot be easily moved into the cloud, or at least quickly moved into the cloud. So it will take me some time to move that over. But still, I want to be able to leverage the power of the cloud. I want to be building new applications with the newest application development models. I want to be using cloud services. How do I do that while I have that dependency on my database? That's one kind of like pattern that we see. Other patterns that we see are regulation or specific contractual commitments that require customers to keep data in a particular place. Think of, for example, betting or specific workloads that are governmental or are sensitive due to different reasons that need to be in country, in state, or even in some cases in a particular data center, right? Like those regulations do not necessarily allow you to move everything on the cloud. But again, you want to be leveraging the power of the cloud to write applications or to develop the rest of your systems while keeping those data in the right place. And then the last kind of, if we see 3 areas, let's say, 3 is a nice number to think about, is the amount of data that's being created by the exponential increasing sensors. And, we tend to, in the modern world, amass data from every possible way we can and every possible system we can. And sometimes moving this data around or sending it to the cloud is impractical or not cost effective, or there are time constraints. So again, these are applications that, need to be written in order to take advantage of this data. So for, that's kind of like an ultra low latency use case also, where, you have end users that need to interact with applications in particularly interactive ways, or you have very sensitive to latency machine-to-machine communication. That's like, let's call it the fourth area. So the way that we've been approaching this is we've been extending the AWS cloud with a number of products to enable customers to still take advantage of all of our service offerings and the breadth and the depth of our platform while conforming to these different requirements that they might have across these categories.
Laura, from your perspective, trying to implement aspects of the cloud, which sounds like from our conversations before, you're pretty far along. Can you give us a sense of the evolution for you? How much has been piecemeal types of approaches to keep data on site versus some wholesale adoption?
So I think it's a really interesting question you've got. We've really taken an approach at first, which was net new. We're going to build in the cloud. And of course, there's all sorts of applications now that are software as a service that whether you want to or not, you're going to be in the cloud. So for example, Office 365 is a big one where everybody has to pretty much go to the cloud now if you want to use Office 365. So a lot of those are already in the cloud. Then you have the Salesforces and the Workdays that are all in the cloud. So you end up with significant portions of your application suite in the cloud without even really trying. That's just how software is sold these days. But when you come to some of our more proprietary and perhaps some might call legacy technologies, when we're building on them, we really say cloud first. Not cloud only, but cloud first. And in fact, moving our data is one way we thought about it, is if you have a center of gravity of data in the cloud, then people are going to have to go to the cloud to build. And so we've done some of that where we're allowed to. We are putting our data in the cloud, and then you will find that the applications start to develop in the cloud as a result of that. The other interesting thing is you can, within the cloud, keep things within a region. So where we have data that has to stay resident in Canada or stay resident in the US, then absolutely we specify the regions that that data has to stay in, and that can be accommodated generally. In terms of thinking about how you go to the cloud, there's three real ways that I think about it, going back to George's threes. One is really to take the data, like I talked about, and create that center of massive data, and then everybody's going to follow the data. They're going to go there. The other way to do it is to take sort of suites of related applications. So maybe it's all your mobile apps, maybe it's all your web-based apps. And doing that, you can take those suites, containerize them, and move to cloud. And the other way we are thinking about it, and we may do this for some sets of applications, is actually to move the lower environments. So your dev and your test environments, build those in the cloud. Now, the developers and the testers and the folks who are going to be operating these systems are all learning about it and developing it in the cloud. And then when it comes time to go into production, you might think that you're going to end up going into production on-prem, but in fact, you're going to slowly have people pull your production into the cloud because they've built it and they're now familiar with operating and developing in the cloud. And every chance they get, they'll start to move production to the cloud. So for different sets of applications, we're actually thinking a little bit differently. Sometimes we're going to lead with data. Sometimes we're going to lead with the lower environments. And sometimes we're just going to pick up suites and go.
So zooming out, Anurag, can you give us a sense of what the adoption has been like in the industries that you cover, just to get a sense of the penetration and how far along companies really are in this evolution? And I call it an evolution of both hybrid and other types of models.
Yes, Lisa. So the way we look at it is very, in a very two-way system. There are cloud-born companies that have been responsible for the first big push towards all the growth in cloud. So if you look at the cloud spending in total, it's somewhere around $320 billion right now, according to IDC data. Now that comes out from a total IT spend of about 1.6 trillion. Now even within that 320, only about 120 is about infrastructure and platform work, while about 200 is SaaS applications that Laura mentioned, the likes of Salesforce and Workday. So the way we look at it, that for the past 15 years, 10 to 20 years, depending on whether you look at infrastructure or applications, bulk of this growth is coming from people signing on new business, which is people looking at cloud-born companies, the likes of Uber or Lyft, that basically started off on the cloud and scaled and grew with them. But in our view, the next phase of growth is going to come from this hybrid model where companies that have been in existence prior to the cloud era start to move more and more of their applications into this hybrid platform. Now, one is easy, which is if you had an old legacy, let's say HR application, you move that over and you go to either Workplace, or SAP or Oracle. If you had a customer service application, you move to either Salesforce again or one of the other vendors. But the big question is when you have a lot of these homegrown applications, just like an example that George said, that is built on a database that has been around for 10, 15, 20 years. What do you do with that application? We think the next big phase of growth is going to come from that, and that is what is going to drive adoption. In our view right now, and when we talked to Laura, we found out differently, but financial services firms mostly are the ones that are the farthest ahead. And we think that number is no more than like 15, 20%, 10 to 15, depending on who you ask. But in certain cases, some companies are far ahead.
So I guess that before we get into just what some of the obstacles are and how this is going, Laura, you were talking a lot about how everything will just migrate there. And if there's an application there, naturally, everything will be sucked in there into the cloud. And you have this cloud first kind of policy. What are the benefits? I mean, what are the reasons why there is such a gravitational force?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. Because it's not what you might think. You might think that it's cheaper to operate in the cloud, and that is true for some workloads where you need to have some big compute at some times and some very little compute at other times, and you don't want to have to buy that yourself so that you constantly have the capacity for a large amount of compute. So for some workloads, it's cheaper. But by and large, if you've got a fairly mature, relatively robust data center that's highly virtualized, there's not a dollars and cents reason to go to the cloud from the perspective of just operating the technology. That's just not a great business case. I'd say the margin there is 5 or 10%. And sometimes I've even found it's more expensive to go to the cloud. You go to the cloud because the tools are better. The innovation on the cloud, people like George are thinking every day, what new features and functions am I going to offer on the cloud that Laura can't afford to build and innovate on herself? So you get a lot of tools and capabilities that developers use. You get a lot of the tools that allow you to move faster and work in that more agile way. And frankly, I am going to struggle over time to bring talent into the organization that will not want to work in cloud. Folks, especially, maybe folks a little younger than I am, will want to work in those kinds of environments with that kind of technology, and you won't actually be able to attract them. So I see the future of being able to do and run a technology shop really involves moving to the cloud, as well as all those agility and business benefits so you can get value out to clients faster. And you can leverage the innovation that George is coming up with us.
Okay, so George, now you're on the spot about all your innovation. Does the product to sell itself? When you go in there, and it's just a matter of you finding ways to make it the least expensive and least cumbersome for the clients, or is it to sort of understand what the potential benefits are?
Well, I think, like Laura described, a lot of our customers lead with agility as the key value proposition that they love, right? We do a lot of the undifferentiated heavy lifting, as we like to think about it, so that they can focus themselves on what makes their business different and what gives them an edge in the competitive marketplace, right? I have seen customers also really care about cost and actually get a lot of cost improvements. Obviously, it depends on your workloads and how you do things, but the main reasons underpinning that is, first of all, we have the scale. So the scale gives you economies of scale that we can pass on to customers, but also it allows you to plan better. When you're in the cloud, you don't have to purchase for your 5 years out or even provision your compute capacity for the peak, but you can elastically kind of like go up and down as your own demand, your own end users or your own applications kind of like require. But I do hear also from customers the innovation argument. We do have a large set of folks really thinking every day, how do we make our customers' lives easier by inventing both up the stack with managed services, but also at the infrastructure layer, and hybrid is a really good example of that. When we're thinking about new products of, okay, you're facing that obstacle that doesn't allow you to build new applications in the AWS region, what can we do for that? I particularly like one example of our products called AWS Outposts, because it exactly focuses on that issue, and it shows you how focused we are on solving these customer problems. With basically what we did is we've built this infrastructure and service product called Outposts that you can now install in your data center and extend the AWS cloud over to where you need it, where your database that we've been talking about is running. And what this allows you to do is use the same APIs and the same tools and the same services that you're used to use into the cloud. Like Laura said, your engineering force, Laura is training her engineering force to be able to deliver very quickly and efficiently by using the cloud. Now they can do that, the same thing in their own data center for those applications that require ultra low latency to that database, or are talking to a particular manufacturing robot or what have you. So we feel like we should be earning our customers' business every hour and every minute. So no, it doesn't sell itself. We are particularly focused on helping people like Laura who really want to innovate.
Well, Anurag, given some of the benefits here, what has been the obstacle for such a low adoption? And why isn't there a faster race, considering that there are benefits, and every company in their earnings talks about the cloud, and certainly we've seen AWS and Azure over at Microsoft absolutely crush it?
Yeah, so Lisa, the answer is fairly simple. It's the ROI associated with building a new application versus porting over an old application. So for any CIO, the question is, I have limited budget. The budget only remains flat to slightly up next year. Now, what do? I need to invest a lot in the newest technologies that are out there that are built on cloud. So if I want to write a new application, that's an easy decision. Go out and make it. But I still have, 50, 60, 70% of my CapEx just goes to maintain my lights on. Now, the question is, what do I do with that portfolio? So I got to take apart each application every year, figure out what do I move first? I need to re-engineer it. There's a lot of cost that goes in it because you have to run them parallel for a while. So that's really where the struggle is, because a lot of the IT footprint that has been developed for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that just cannot go away overnight. I mean, it's not possible. And I think that's really the struggle for a lot of them, is to find the time, the money, and the patience to port over those applications.
One thing that we've talked about before is the idea of having data sets on legacy data providers or legacy platforms like Oracle, that there have been previous providers that don't offer the same kinds of cloud benefits. And how do you manage that? How do you transfer things over? And, George, I want to start with you. Has that been an obstacle? Has that been difficult to have data transferred from legacy providers?
Moving into the cloud does require some initial effort, but what we have seen is that most obstacles are not actually technical. Most, when customers first start, it's more about having a leadership alignment. Both Anurag and Laura talked about this. Is like, do we want to do this? And is there a top-down mandate from CTOs and CIOs that are forward-looking on, this is a great investment long-term for us? As long as we've seen these decisions being made and having these mandates and having alignment at the leadership level, then the really next level of obstacles is, some of the learning the new skills on the cloud, and some of the approach that Laura has been talking about, which is actually I believe is a great and really strong approach, which is don't try to boil the ocean. Start with the things that you can move today, and then you are creating that gravity that everyone wants to use the cloud because there are obvious benefits that we talked about. Now you've created that gravity around it. Now, to your question, there is data that needs to be moved. Many times we see the data being moved easily, even from all their more traditional and kind of like legacy to an extent solutions to the cloud. We've had migration tools also that AWS is offering to make customers' life easier there, etc. But there is some also, like we talked about, data gravity that needs, if you have 1 billion sensors in a factory that's all generating data, that you need to process some of that locally. So yes, there are some technical obstacles, but I think that AWS is providing you the features and the services that you need to do that. It's more about getting that alignment, forward-looking leadership.
Laura, what's been your experience in terms of obstacles that you faced that were unexpected, or any kind of unexpected bumps that you've encountered?
I don't know that they're unexpected per se, but I think George described very well. Every year you only have so much budget, and you have to make choices about the approach. And so, when you have something new, it is more straightforward. When you want to buy, we're in the middle of replacing our general ledger system. If you buy a new general ledger system, as an example, you are going to now move to cloud. If you are going to go to workplace, your HR systems, you're going to go to cloud. You almost don't have a choice anymore. So that's straightforward. It really is the discussion around, do you want to port some of the legacy systems, which you can do purely from an infrastructure point of view, or do you want to take the time to modernize those and rethink your business models? And if you start to try to modernize, which is a great thing to do because it gives you increased flexibility, it gives you much more agility than just porting the infrastructure, then you really need to do it at a pace that aligns with your organization's strategy. So where we've had a strategy that says we need to modernize this aspect of our business, and maybe a good example of that is in the US, we had some APIs that we wanted to build between some of the HR systems and our own benefit systems, and we knew that we needed to, and we wanted to modernize. Doing that on the cloud is great, but over time, you're only going to be able to go as fast as the business strategy really pushes you to go. As I said, if you're just moving from an infrastructure point of view and you're not at the same time refactoring or modernizing the older technology stack, you don't get as much benefit, and because you don't get as much flexibility. But the other thing is, from an operating perspective, other than for some specific workloads, and I think, George, you alluded to this as well, there's not necessarily a compelling cost case to say, we're going to move to the cloud and everything's going to be cheaper. You really have to have other reasons to do it.
From the stock market perspective,
sometimes the data residency does get in the way. That we have some government contracts, et cetera, and sometimes data residency is a challenge for sure.
Is that something that a hybrid kind of model to keep it local could address, or is it more restricted?
No, I think it could. I'm always very reluctant to abstract the data from the code. You want that code and data, not physically distant, because the amount of slowdown you get when you do that is huge. So to me, just having your data in a different place than your code isn't an ideal architecture. So I'd rather keep the data and the code together.
Anurag, what's your sense in terms of the CIOs and the CTOs that have to make these decisions, whether they're emboldened by shareholders of the company that reward them for spending on things like the cloud, whether if they can say, hey, we're sort of like a tech company too, they'll see everyone cheer, that's a good thing, or do they feel constrained, right? I mean, this is sort of the question of the moment as you see so many companies with actual cash cushions.
Yeah, I'll actually agree with how Laura is thinking. That's how I think a large portion of the CIOs will think, is unless you see some absolute benefit from moving it's not needed. Now, the fun part is, let's say I'm going to take financial services industry as an example. It's getting bombarded with new entrants. People were digitally born banks, broker dealers that are coming, out starting with mobile apps. You have fintech companies that are, emerging every day. So now what does a traditional bank do? They have to figure out that their old consumer banking system, their old capital market system, that needs to be modernized. And does it make sense to spend a lot of money recoding it or starting from scratch to write some of these applications on the cloud? Now, for example, I'll give you, Goldman, along with AWS, created their, the Apple credit card, for example. It is amazing as to the customer service that you get from that particular card. You can text people and get your, work done. You can't text somebody that was born before the smartphone or a system that was developed before the smartphone was there. So the banks, or for that matter, anybody, whether that be airline systems or retailers, will be forced to upgrade their older systems. I am on the camp that those older systems will die their natural death over time. Now, that could be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And those companies will start to come up with newer systems, straight from scratch.
So as we're talking about all this data that we're moving around and the different companies are moving around, an audience member asked us to talk about cybersecurity and outages, which is a very important topic. I want to start with outages simply because we saw this last week where people couldn't get their refrigerators programmed and we had all sorts of shipping delays because of, I believe, AWS is right, downing. I'm wondering, George, you can address it first, how that is sort of protected against for people who are relying on that increasingly for their businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me preempt that with every engineered system that humans can make is prone to have problems, right? The question becomes, does your engineering force or your cloud provider like AWS really focus on minimizing these problems and making sure that even when they happen, they learn from and so that they can never happen again. So it's natural for customers to be worried about uptime and availability, but it's one of the top priorities of AWS, really. The way that we like to think about it is, first, we are obsessed at increasing the amount of availability that our infrastructure can handle, but also we like to provide customers with the architecture that they can build on so that they can create applications that are fault tolerant. So on that first part, even when you're on your own data center, you might actually experience a lot of outages because your power is not redundant, or your cooling, or what have you, or you haven't built your infrastructure architecture in a way that eliminates single points of failures, and so on and so on. AWS has been focusing, for more than a decade now, improving that over and over again. So at the infrastructure layer, I think that we're doing a good job, but we can always do better, and we're always learning and improving. Now, at the application layer, what AWS and as a cloud offering gives you is it gives you these units of compute, storage, and other services, which we call AWS regions, that are completely independent from each other, allowing you to build applications that are globally distributed and fault tolerant. Within an AWS unit, we also give you different data centers. We call them availability zones. They are infrastructure deployments within a region that allow you, again, to use them because they are completely independent from each other, both from the networking power, but even from the control plane and software way. They're completely independent between them, so that even when an event happens, it doesn't affect multiple of those zones or multiple of those regions. We think that providing our customers and educating them about how to build fault-tolerant and high availability applications is the most important thing. And a server is a server, a fan is a fan. It can always break. The question is, are we focusing on building systems that are engineered in a way that can not get affected by these single points of failure?
And Laura, what's been your experience in terms of how you try to back things up or protect against an outage so that you can keep going?
So I think George made some really excellent points there, and I think about it in a very similar way. I think as an individual organization, sure, I can have redundant data centers and I can have redundant servers within those data centers, and I can, even dig my own well, and I can have two different sources of power. But at the end of the day, AWS and providers like them are really building at a different kind of scale than any individual organization could probably do. Because they're doing it and they're having multiple clients, this is really where I think the scale does pay off. If I talked a couple times now about, well, I can't, it's not really that much cheaper depending on the workload to go to the cloud. I'm going for other reasons. But I think over time, this is one of the areas where there will be a differentiation. And if I really want to get that level of resiliency, it becomes very expensive for me to do on my own. Whereas if I'm relying on George and his friends to have the redundant availability zones and the redundant regions, and even, redundant regions within the same country, if I have data residency issues, those are all things that are really good for me as an individual organization, that I can leverage all that redundancy that would be very expensive for me to build. If I were to build duplicate data centers in different regions, all within all the countries that we operate, it would be prohibitively expensive. But AWS is doing just that. Now, having said that, I know sometimes the industry talks a lot about concentration risk. So if you had every bank, say in the US, in the cloud, in the same region, without redundancy to fall back to a different region, that might be some kind of big concentration risk. And it's kind of an interesting dilemma for the industry, because I think for any individual organization, it absolutely over time is going to make sense to leverage all that investment that AWS is making in resiliency, but it will create a situation where you do have this concentration risk. I mean, we already have it, to your point. If an AWS region goes down, multiple businesses are impacted.
So, Anurag, from your perspective, how big of a concern is this for companies when deciding which provider to go to and whether to move certain applications to the cloud?
Yeah, so I've thought about this problem a lot, and I put it in 3 or 4 different buckets. The first one is cybersecurity. Now, from our research, the hyperscale cloud providers spend billions in security, and that is far above any of the, you could say, individual IT department of any large bank or any large industrial company can actually afford. So from that point, I think the amount of money that goes into it, I personally feel that the hyperscale cloud providers are much more secure than any other internal IT department for, I would say, most Fortune 2000 companies. Second comes is the cloud availability or the region availability. Now, from that point, right now we do get a lot of press when, one region goes down. And I think one of the ways to solve it is go to different regions, have duplications. But down the road, what will happen, and it's not happening right now, but I think it'll take a few years, is each of the companies will have a backup cloud provider where they will have the ability to, move back and forth if needed. Now, that would require a lot more technology work, refactoring of applications in a different way. We are not there yet. I think, down the road, we'll get there. And the way I think of this in parallel to is just power generation. For a lot of important companies, they get power, to them from 2 different grids. If it's very critical to them. And that's how I think about cloud down the road, is very much like a utility provider, because down the road, that's kind of the work that they would be offering to their customers.
Since you mentioned cybersecurity, I was trying to break out outages from cybersecurity, because I think of them as 2 different things. And with cybersecurity, I think about, intentional attacks and people trying to get information, get data. Laura, I'd love to start with you. How big of a concern is this? Are you surprised at the security, what goes into it, or the vulnerabilities that you've experienced as you've gone through this process?
So at Sun Life, we are always thinking about cybersecurity. I think many in the industry will be aware there is a worldwide vulnerability that sort of broke on Friday that is impacting many organizations, especially their web-facing sites. It's pretty significant, the amount of effort that needs to go into it, and I agree. I think that the hyperscalers, the AWSs, and their immediate competitors, those top 4 or 5 organizations in the world who do this, are going to be able over time to spend much more on cybersecurity and defenses than any single IT department of any large organization could do even. And so it's not to say, and I like how George described it, it's not that AWS, when we use them, is providing all our security. We also have to do a significant amount of work to configure things to the appropriate, in the appropriate way. We have our own defenses that we put on top of what AWS provides with us. I think it is a joint effort to make sure that we are taking advantage of all the investments AWS makes, but also that we're protecting our own assets in a way that is acceptable from our risk appetite perspective. So it's really, I see it's the AWS efforts on top of or in addition to the efforts that we're going to make as well. And over time, we're better off with the combined efforts of both AWS and then our own specific situation. That's going to help us. But for sure, cyber is an ever-increasing part of my budget.
So, George, from the perspective of hybrid, do you find that people think that when you keep data closer to home, it's more secure? Or is that, sort of irrelevant and all of the data is equally vulnerable to people who are motivated?
I mean, there are misconceptions out there, and there are true concerns as well. I think that, to be honest, Anurag and Laura kind of nailed it. First of all, there is a shared security responsibility model. If your application is not secure, it doesn't matter how much secure the infrastructure is. So what Laura is saying, like architecting your application in a way that's secure is super important. Now, I don't want to repeat what Anurag said, but spending, security is the top AWS priority, and we're spending a lot of time and money and effort in ensuring that our platform is the most secure one. But a good example when it comes to hybrid, for example, that you mentioned, is those cross-cutting features of security that enable you to build hassle-free and concern-free. For example, encryption. There is 150 AWS services that deal with data, all support encryption by default for all of your data, right? When your data is encrypted in the most modern standards, the actual location of where it is less important, right? Sometimes if data is in your own system, in your own data center, it might actually be less secure than the cloud, because do you have the same physical security models with guards and cages and LAN badges and cameras, etc., but not only physical, also feature-wise on the infrastructure layer, like encryption and like service features that allow you to ensure security. So when you're looking at AWS and you're thinking that everything from every customer from the military to worldwide banks is trusting the cloud for their security, and if you think that the AWS platform is built with the same infrastructure and the same hardware and the same services and the same encryption, whether it's hybrid model, whether it's services like Outpost that I mentioned before, or local zones, or the AWS region, all of these cross-cutting features that the military and top secret workloads can run on, now we provide to you. I mean, it's pretty easy to understand that that's probably a higher security bar than most customers, or at least many customers, can achieve by themselves.
Anurag, there is a question that came in for you specifically from the audience about what cases of hybrid cloud strategy have you seen that particularly were impressive? What's your sense?
So I'll mention, I think Microsoft is doing some really good work there. Largely because of their footprint of Office 365, as well as their strong foothold in their own databases that can be then transferred over to the cloud-based aspect of it. And it's not just the technology; it's actually because Microsoft's been at corporate enterprises for over, I think, 25, 30 years selling those services. And when it comes to the other two hyperscale cloud providers, that's the biggest one being AWS and then Google, they were just not present there in the old technology layer. So they are pushing harder now with their alliances with, the likes of VMware, or coming up with their own way to tap into some of those older technologies, so that they can port them over. So that's where we think, we look at Microsoft numbers, their both server products as legacy products, as well as their Azure products, are doing fairly well. I do want to mention one more thing. What George said was another advantage I see of public cloud infrastructure is it's very homogeneous in nature. And if you go back to a legacy IT environment or an internal IT environment, that's plugged together with several companies or several different technologies, cobbled together, which makes it a little bit easier for somebody to enter the gates, from a cybersecurity point of view.
Anurag, how much dominance do the two major players have? And I do realize that I'm asking this with George sitting right here, and I will ask him to weigh in. But the dominance of Azure and AWS, it seems like a two-party system here dominating the cloud. Is that correct? And is this going to continue, or are there other entrants that are going to definitely take some share?
So this is an area where I think these two vendors, along with Google, will dominate for a very long period of time. See, unlike the older technologies where, if I was a little bit smarter, I could in my garage come up with some new product that can take on some of the older stuff. But not in this case, because what you really need is billions of dollars of investments to come up with those data centers. Even if I am the largest bank today, I cannot match my per unit processing cost. Forget the processing cost, but just the number of features I can come up with in order to build on that stuff. So if you have a moat, and that moat is through billions of dollars of CapEx that you've already spent with so much of global data centers, that makes it very easy for them to keep on defending that marketplace, whether it's, when AWS and Microsoft combined actually are gaining share for the past, 10 years from all the smaller vendors. And now with Google's, I would say, a recent, I would say, foray into the enterprise market, I mean, they're making very strong inroads as well.
So Laura, when you are shopping around, is there a very clear distinction between the major players? Is there a lot of daylight between them, or is there just sort of similar parallel offerings on different platforms?
I think our decision, and honestly, we are partnering primarily with AWS, but obviously we also have Office 365 on Azure. And it's not that we only put things on AWS. We also use Google Cloud in Asia for our G Suite and for our Asia advisors. So we're using Google, AWS, and Azure, as well as, frankly, a couple other players. For example, we. When you look at mainframe, IBM is offering a Z Cloud. So if you have mainframe apps and you want to move to a cloud model, that is an option as well that we're considering. So I think we already are into a multi-cloud model, but we have partnered, I guess, primarily with AWS for the large part of our compute. And the reason for that really came down to a few things. We believe AWS is still really ahead in the data space, and data, we believe, is really important. And so we said that would be one. The other one, frankly, is AWS was a great partner to us. And so at the time that the decision was made, I would say we felt most comfortable with AWS as a partner, and they continue to make inroads in the technology. But the reality is now, I don't think anyone can avoid having a multi-cloud model. And I think you're going to look at the different cloud providers for different types of workload and different applications.
George, a question coming in specifically for you, whether you could give any advice to organizations as they try to prepare for some sort of hybrid cloud strategy.
Yeah, I think that actually Laura gave that in the beginning, and I will just concur with her. You need to start thinking about the best place is the cloud. So let's start with the defaults. Most of my applications need to be there. That gives you the scalability, gives you better cost, efficiency. It's just the best place to really deploy most of your applications. When you're thinking about what needs to be remain local, you have to really figure out why, and whether these reasons that you are figuring out are short-term or long-term reasons. So there is kind of, I like to think of it in two buckets. One is there are the workloads that for long-term will probably remain on premises. Let's say you have a manufacturing facility and you have a robot. The robot will remain on premises, right? It won't move to the cloud. So some of the compute and some of the data processing may need to happen in the cloud. Other parts, you need to transition to the cloud. So when you're thinking about an application that you're a database and an application that you're running in the database against that database is this transition of a kind of a stepping stone. Let me get started with cloud native applications on existing workloads and then slowly move these to the cloud. But the majority of these you will see moving. The question is, I guess, how do you use everything in a way that's consistent so that you don't have to, whatever it's on premise or whatever is the cloud, you need to really learn. Yeah. And that's how we're kind of educating customers, and that's what we're focusing on, is how does every AWS service, including things that we mentioned today, like Outpost, which is in your data center, local zones that is in the closest metro that you are in, the AWS region, AWS Wavelength, which is our 5G edge offering, all of them, they are unified under the same tools, the same APIs, the same hardware, the same security models, the same availability models, so that when you are thinking about how do I plan this out, you don't need to take a huge bite. You can start with, let me move the things that are very transparently and obviously easily to move to the cloud, and then I can keep moving more and more of my applications without having to relearn tools and do a lot of effort later on.
We just have a couple minutes left, and I want to wrap things up with some predictions. And Anurag, I want to start with you. In 10 years' time, are there still going to be applications, a lot of companies that have applications that are not on the cloud? Or do you think that this will just sort of be the de facto way of business?
I think there will be applications that are on-premise, similar to what we just heard about, IBM mainframe. It's been around for a very long period of time. Now, the problem I'm having on that prediction is those companies that are going to keep them on-premise and not update them, they'll have a very hard time competitively. Now, they might be regulated entities, they might be utilities that might not be competing ahead for market share. But frankly speaking, if you don't have an application that can cater to a world that is full of, everybody working on a mobile device, everybody shopping through social media channels, everybody looking at the metaverse coming in. If you don't have products that can cater to that, then you might as well, you're probably a government entity or a regulated entity that, nobody can take that share away from you. But the bulk of the applications and the bulk of I would say, data will reside on the cloud, because people will soon figure out it is far safer to be in the cloud than keeping it on-premise.
Laura, you're nodding. You agree?
I agree. And, at Sun Life, we're using really hybrid cloud now, but I just see us being more and more in the cloud. It really accelerates our ability to innovate and deliver faster for our clients and our employees and advisors. And, I always tell my team, I dream of a day where we can get a client issue in the morning, work with agile teams, relying on cloud and other modern technologies to deliver a solution by end of day and put it in overnight. And within 24 hours, we've now met a client need that we hadn't met 24 hours before. And to do that, we're going to need cloud.